Welcome to Dear Book Coach. I'm Terry Thayer, certified book coach, certified focusing professional, and author.
I'm Carrie Savage, writer and certified book coach.
And I'm Stephanie Detlefs, writer and certified book coach.
This is a friendly advice space for you as you plan, draft, and revise your novel. In each video, we answer a question submitted by a writer like you from 3 points of view, and you get to pick the advice that works for you. Today's question comes from a member of the Facebook Dear Book Coach, Laura Elizabeth. How much of your own life events can play into a work of fiction, obviously changing names and other details without it being an issue? Thanks, Laura Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I get to go first. And shout out to Laura for being a friend of mine and a former coworker. She is awesome, and I'm super excited that she submitted this question and to hear more about what's going on in her writing life. But I think to start off, there's a lot of nuance to this question. And I think in large part, it really depends on both the writer and the people around the writer. Relating back to a little bit of personal experience, the first novel that I ever started was based on a fictionalized version of the story of my adoption, which is kind of crazy and will probably make some sort of good fiction someday. But while I had changed a lot of the names, or all of the names and a lot of the details, it was so, to me, clearly my own story that I kind of couldn't get past it. It would have been fine with my family if I had written something based on this story. Both my adoptive family and the biological family that I know have encouraged me as a writer to, use this and for material. But I just kept picturing how people would say or assume that they were such and such a character and whether they were correct or not. And it gave me a mental block. So I set it aside for now. I am convinced I will come back to it someday. Hopefully I'll figure out a way to tackle it. But that said, like, your life and your experiences are your own, and you should feel like you can tell your story however you choose and however it feels real to you. And again, this is sort of, we're working from the assumption that you're working on a novel and not a memoir. At least I'm working on an assumption. You will need to recognize that some people will recognize themselves, whether they're intended to be recognized or not, and they might get upset and they might get offended. And you just need to sort of weigh that and what that means to you. I think having conversations with people ahead of time to give them a heads up that you're doing this project, and even reassure them if you feel like they might need reassurance. You can tell them, hey, it might feel like this is you, but trust me, it's not. And ultimately, I think, having those conversations can be important and a great way to get over that hurdle and sort of feel a little bit more confidence in telling the story. But you can always remember following that chestnut that I feel like I see at the end of Law and Order episodes all the time, even when they do the rip from the headlines thing, which, resemblance to real people and events, living or dead, is strictly coincidental. You always have that to fall back on in fiction, and that's one of the many reasons that we love it. So that's sort of my high level take on that. Stephanie, what do you think?
Yeah, I I love that too. I mean, you always can say that. It can be completely autobiographical, and yet you can say, nope, none of it is real. So you have that safety net. I was reminded with this question about I heard Elizabeth Gilbert, the author, known most famously probably for Eat, Pray, Love, a memoir, but she writes fiction and nonfiction. And she said in an interview, and I'm paraphrasing, that a reader would probably find more personal stuff about her in her fiction than in her memoir. Like, she tends to almost hold back on deeply personal things more in memoir, probably for all the reasons that you were just saying, Carrie, fear of whatever it might be from the outside world. Writers, we can't help but put ourselves into fiction, whether it's our exploring our relationships or our beliefs or our own personal struggles, or that's where our stories come from. So even if we're writing something that is so completely different from our own real life, there's still going to be parts of us and our own lives on the page. And I don't think there's really a right answer to this question. I think it all comes down to what the writer is most comfortable with. I know I had a client recently go through this, and I think sometimes writers decide to write a true story from their own lives as fiction because writing it as memoir is too scary for them. They're too concerned about hurting people around them or putting too much out into the world for other people to know. And so they choose to fictionalize the story, or maybe it's because they wish the ending was different. Maybe they had something happen and they wish it had turned out differently, so they want to explore that in fiction. And if this is what you're doing, just be honest about it with yourself. And down the road, talk about it with anyone who might need to know, the same way you would do with a memoir. But again, like Carrie said, it's your story to tell. So for now, while you're writing, just put as much truth in it as needs to be there in order to complete the story. You can always go back and change pertinent details later, switch around timelines that might give away things about other people involved in your real story, anything that's concerning to you. And that way you can always change later. I say in the early drafts, especially, just put all the truth on the page that needs to be there. I just wanted to wrap up by saying that one of my favorite quotes from a writer is from Anne Lamott, who says that if people didn't want to appear in her books, they should have behaved better. And I love that quote so much. And I think all of our lives are fodder for our stories. And if people are related to a writer, they know that in some way they should know that in some way they're going to end up in your stories. So you can always just shrug and go, I don't know, it's fiction, and leave it at that. So I hope that helps. Terry, what do you think?
It reminds me of a sweatshirt that I used to have that said, be careful or you'll wind up in my novel.
Yeah.
And I changed mine to say, be careful or you'll wind up dead in my novel, since I wrote mysteries. But, I wrote 4 mysteries set in a quilt shop while I was working in a quilt shop. And I was very careful not to take the direct stories of my customers or my friends. What I tried to capture was the essence of what they were going through. And it could be totally different circumstances, but to have that emotional impact. How did they handle their happiness, their gains, their wins, their losses? And in my case, always bringing it back to quilting and murder, because that's what I was writing about. And that's your job as a writer, is to extrapolate these stories and meaning and put it into a form that has a narrative arc and narrative drive. Real life doesn't always have that. It doesn't always, like you said, have closure. It's often really difficult if you're trying to stick to a timeline. This happened and then this happened and then this happened. You can very often lose the narrative drive if you're writing about real stuff. What Carrie said about people finding themselves in my book, I found that people found themselves that were not anywhere, were not in my book at all, but thought they were. And I had one character that I did base on a local businessman who was really not a good guy. And of course, he was too narcissistic to notice. And I don't think he ever read my books. He pretended he did, but I don't think he ever did. And even that character, I wrote 4 in that series. By the third or fourth one, that character was no longer a bad guy, because I needed my main character to have an ally in the business. And so he turned into which the guy in real life never turned into a good guy, but the guy in the book turned into a good guy. So don't forget, your characters are there to suit your story, and your events are there to suit your story. But weird things happen. I had clothing show up from my novel. I swear I made it up. This same guy, I put my character in a Nehru jacket with a dragon across the front, like red with this solid gold dragon. And I was at an opening of the San Jose Quilt Museum, and my narcissist came in the room wearing that jacket, and my jaw just dropped, and I swear to you, I had never seen him before in that jacket. I would swear up and down I probably had, but here he came, like, and I couldn't even speak. I was just like, oh my God, he's here in the flesh. And then I had another funny thing happen where a woman who had quite a colorful life that I did not include in my book at all because it was all a little too colorful. Probably 5 years after I'd written my books, I was at a quilt convention in San Jose again, at the San Jose Quilt Convention, which is huge, which this convention gets about 12,000 people a day through the doors. So we're in this very crowded convention, and I hear, Terry, you ruined my life. You stole my life. This woman is shouting down this aisle of crowded, and I just was like, excuse me, what? And she was convinced that somehow I had stolen her life, that I had taken all the lives of the customers and stolen them. So you can't always, you can't always, plan for what's going to happen. But yeah, so you can't worry about it if people are going to see, because people are going to see what they're going to see. So that's my take on it. Carrie, back to you.
Yeah, I think it's funny. I mean, everybody wants their 15 minutes of fame, right? Whether it's
they're going to find themselves in there. Yeah,
exactly. And you're right, Terry. It's probably the people that you don't include in your books who are going to be like, that character was 100% me. And you're like, no, I didn't even think of you at all when I was creating that. So yeah, ultimately, you obviously can't control what other people think. You can only control what you put out into the world. So that is a good thing to remember, ultimately.
for sure.
And that is it for today. Laura, we hope that you found an answer and other people found an answer as well that made sense to you at this point in your life and at this point in your book. Remember that you can submit your question anytime at dearbookcoach.com and subscribe to our weekly email to be eligible to win a monthly call with a coach. Or sorry, every month we choose a winner for a call with a coach. Also, during the month of September, we're doing a weekly Instagram live talking about our mentor, Jenny Nash's new book, Blueprint for a Book. So be sure to follow us on Instagrams to catch those, and we will see you next time. Bye.